Hi there, this is Jason Major with another episode of Biblical Cinematic Universe, where I review Bible movies, so movies that are based directly on the Bible and their interpretations of how the stories. So the one I want to review today is the classic David and Bathsheba. This is from 1951, written for the screen by Philip Dunn and directed by Henry King. This movie stars Gregory Peck as King David and Susan Hayward as Bathsheba. And I just have to say, this movie is fantastic. I love this movie. Actually, it's in my opinion, one of the best Old Testament Bible movies. It's not based on Moses or Joseph. And so in this movie, what you got is there's on this DVD you have a little featurette. It says "Once in 3,000 Years." So it looks like a short film that basically was designed in this little short black and white film that would have been playing in cinemas, I'm assuming. You have Gregory Peck playing himself and meeting Susan Hayward on the lot of 20th Century Fox. And basically he goes in and he finds out that he's playing King David. And then in the story, you see him as he shows you some of the production designs, some of the artistic designs, and then he goes and meets the writer of the David and Bathsheba screenplay. And it was really interesting because in that scene, the writer says to him, if you're going to study the life of King David, do what I did, which is read the Old Testament first. And he shows him the Old Testament, and you see this kind of love for the scriptures and the story, and it's very respectful all through the dialogue. Even when the original director talks about the movie, he's like, and it's all true, and it's kind of this really reverence for the story, and which was really neat. In the movie, so I'm assuming that was probably just an advertisement film, maybe like what we would do now in terms of like some sort of like pre-production video but it was probably shot loosely based on how it transpired, but it's still like a short film. It was kind of neat. Now the movie itself, it gets right into King David's already king. He's fighting with the enemies of Israel. Yeah, you see him fighting in the army a little bit, and then you see him at home, and he's kind of having his day off, and then that's when he sees Bathsheba, played by Susan Hayward. He's kind of like looking over. He gets into a fight with one of his wives, Michelle, who was the daughter of Saul, and then he's looking over the roof, and he sees Bathsheba taking a bath. And this movie really, I thought, did a really great dynamic to the story, and it does a lot of fleshing out of details that, to me, make a lot of sense for the sake of this as a dramatic story. So now in this one, I'll be honest with you, Bathsheba is actually portrayed as very it's definitely a romance between the two. And I think that makes sense in terms of the story. So what they do is that they say that Bathsheba says, I intentionally made sure that you could see me from your rooftop because I wanted to entice your heart. Because this is my relationship with my husband. I'm in this loveless marriage where he loves the glory of war and he doesn't love me. And so that kind of makes it this willing relationship. And King David even says to her, like, I will not force myself upon you. I've never forced anything upon me. If you don't want me, even if I'm a king, I will not do that. And that's when she reveals her heart and says, I want your heart. And then, of course, the story, or most people know the story. What happens is, of course, they start this relationship, this affair, which was against the biblical law for him to do. And then she goes pregnant, and he has to try and hide the pregnancy. So he tries to bring Uriah home to make him convinced that it's going to be that's going to be his baby. But Uriah in this movie is completely a dick. Like, he's completely I like the glory of war. He's only seen his wife for a total of 8 days, so basically he married her and went off to war, which actually biblically was not what you're supposed to do, because you're supposed to if you were just newly married, you were supposed to care for your wife. In this movie, he just basically all he cares about is war and the law, and so when David tries to pry out of him and say, like, if this potential situation was to happen and your wife did have an affair, what would you do? And he's like, oh, stone her, you know what I mean, to carry out the law. And eventually, David gets basically, he tries to be, in his mind, nice, and then it doesn't work, and so he does what the biblical story does, which is he has Uriah sent to the front lines, and then Uriah dies. Now, in this movie, they elaborate on the idea that because of their sin, the idea is that there's a famine, and there's like now a famine on the land because of what King David is doing, which I have to double check and see if that is actually a biblical part. But the idea is that like you also have for example, you have these really nice character moments with David and Bathsheba, and you also see some of him just like talking about like how he had a friendship with Jonathan. You see him with Nathan as well, the prophet, and the story is really well told and really well acted. And what's interesting about this movie is that as a biblical epic, it's really a battle within. That's what I found really interesting about this interpretation of the story. It's really a battle within. There's not a lot of epic battles with the like big giant sweeping battles. It's more about David and Bathsheba's love and romance and the dialogue between them, and then this internal struggle that once he realizes Nathan the prophet, spoiler alert, says spoiler alert for a Bible story that's 3,000 years old. Nathan the prophet calls him out on it through a parable, and then says, you must atone for your sin. And in this version, the way they present it, I thought is really interesting, because it's like you're basically presenting this battle within. Now, in this movie, which is a little departure from the scripture, they want the Bathsheba, they want to stone her to cleanse land, because the traditional biblical law would be that you stone the adulterous woman. And King David says, no, I want mercy for her, it was my fault. Then what happens is that Bathsheba takes ownership of her sin. And then King David, because he's in love with Bathsheba, he wants mercy for her. So at first he's going to challenge God and say, like, God, you're the wrong one, I'm the bad one, I'm the right one. And then Nathan sort of says, don't you remember the King David of old, who was a shepherd boy, who loved the Lord? And then so you see King David go to the Ark of the Covenant, and then you have this flashback, of course, to the greatest battle, which is David and Goliath. And Goliath was actually played by a real life, like really one of the tall giants of the time. And I mean, by that, just his stature actually was like over 6 feet, 6 feet, whatever. And they show a flashback of that scene, and they kind of like, and then the idea, basically, again, this spoiler, is that King David basically repents before God, kind of prays Psalm 51, and which is creating me a new heart. And then the rains come back, and then God shows mercy. So it's very interesting the way they took this, is that you kind of see how David sees the justice and law of God, because earlier you see like they're trying to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and then it starts to fall because they hadn't done it properly, and one of the priests tries to hold it up, and he falls, and then he dies because he touched the holiness of God, because the Ark represents the holiness of God. It's so full of the holiness of God. And David kind of got upset about that, saying, why did he die? He was trying to help people. He was trying to help God. And then at the end of this movie, King David touches the hand of God, but he does it out of a sense of humility and sort of reverence towards God, saying, I am but a sinner, and I understand that, and he manages to survive. So I think that the movie really shows it's really about David understanding the heart of God. And that makes it really interesting and a unique romance movie, a unique historical epic, in a sense, like I said, a lot of these Bible movies, because the New Testament focuses on Jesus, who's a perfect being, and the Old Testament stories focus on Moses mostly. This makes it a very unique movie in that it is the battle within. And I highly recommend it. Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward, David and Bathsheba, a really excellent biblical movie. Enjoy.